Hi guys, I hope you're all having an amazing day. If you ever wondered what kind of image quality you can get using a cheap manual focusing rail along with the Laowa 25mm ultra macro lens, then keep watching this video. Welcome to the channel. My name is Peter if you're new here, and I am a nature photographer. First, I'd like to just go over the main gear that I used for the upcoming stacked macro shots of a dead moth that I found on the floor in the laundry. If you want to learn about my entire setup, then I've got a number of videos for you that you can check out. The focusing rail that I used is the Neewer Pro 4-way macro focusing rail. If you want to learn about this specific macro focusing rail, then I've got two videos for you. The first one is a brief review, and the other one is about how I normally set it up, which is pretty straightforward. So feel free to check out those as well. The lens, as I previously mentioned, was the Laowa 25mm 2.5 to 5x ultra macro lens. I just did a review recently, so if you are interested in purchasing that lens, I recommend you check out that video. I talk about both the pros and cons in detail in that one. You can also learn in detail about my entire workflow, including post-processing, in a number of my videos. Feel free to check out, for example, this one or my more recent video where I was doing stacked macro shots of a jumping spider. Now I want to briefly talk about the single most important factor that you need to pay great attention to when you do extreme stacked macro shots. That is to minimize vibration and reduce the chance of any motion blur, just to get as sharp images as possible. Ensure that you use a sturdy tripod. That's an absolute must. Make sure that both plates, the plates that you use to attach the camera rail to the tripod and the camera to the rail itself, are both very well secured. Use a remote shutter release, or at least the timer on your camera. Make sure that you turn the control knob on the rail very carefully and at a pace where you keep pausing between taking shots. That further reduces the chance of any motion blur. There are many other factors to consider when you take deep stacked macro shots, and if you want to ensure that your shots are tech sharp, then I recommend you check out this old video of mine as well, where I go over a number of key points that you need to take into consideration. Now briefly, I would like to talk about the exposure settings that I used for these images that I stacked in Zerene Stacker. I used an aperture of f4 on the Laowa 25mm ultra macro lens. I find this to be the absolute sharpest after some extensive testing, and I recommend you use that when you do focus stacking using a rail. Using a wide aperture also reduces the exposure time. The exposure times that I used were between 0.4 and 0.6 seconds, and the ISO was at the lowest possible base ISO of 100, just to make sure that the images were as clean as possible. I know that there are automated rails out there that would make the whole image taking process much easier, but for me personally, I only take a few hundred shots every now and then when I do stacked extreme macros, and I absolutely love the whole process, even though it can be quite tedious and time consuming, and knowing how much effort I put into creating a single image is very rewarding to me. After I had finished taking the images, I uploaded everything into Lightroom, where I did some minor editing and batch processed those files. Once the JPEGs were exported, I imported everything into Zerene Stacker, which is my preferred stacking software. I have compared it to Photoshop's inbuilt stacking algorithm, so if you wonder how efficient Zerene Stacker is when handling large stacks, feel free to have a look at that as well. In Zerene Stacker, I use the PMax, the so-called pyramid method, which is extremely good for preserving plenty of detail, even in low contrast areas, while minimizing the chance of any artifacting that can happen when aligning and stacking plenty of images. Here you can see how much the depth of field increases while the program is gradually stacking these shots. I always love looking at this sequence, it just looks super cool. Now briefly, I would like to talk about a couple of things in terms of post-processing once the images are stacked in Zerene. The first step is normally just about cleaning up the image, removing unwanted little dust particles, for example, or cropping in, especially around the edges when misalignment can happen. Luckily, with these 3 shots that I'll be showing you very soon of that beautiful moth, there wasn't much to get rid of. I only cropped one image in from the right side. Besides the dust particles, I also noticed quite a few stuck or hot pixels that unfortunately, once the images were stacked, left so-called worm trails. There's an inbuilt function or feature in Zerene Stacker that can help you eliminate these worm trails, but I decided to clone them out myself. Felt like I had to give in to my OCD, and I did everything manually. After I have cleaned up the images, I applied a curves adjustment layer using separate color channels. This is the kind of technique that I normally use, just to punch in plenty of contrast without oversaturating the image. After that, I used one of my previously saved actions. I applied a high pass filter and I manually brushed in a preset value into certain parts of the image. High-pass filter is an extremely powerful and very flexible tool when it comes to selective sharpening. I can definitely recommend that you experiment with that. On top of that, in this instance, I decided to use a normal map as well. A normal map is essentially a bump map to create three-dimensional contrast and to further increase texture detail. I learned this specific technique from Piximperfect. You might be familiar with him. He's an amazing teacher in Photoshop, and I definitely recommend you check out his channel if you haven't heard of him yet. And I will also leave a link in the description to this specific video if you want to check it out. Anyway, here are the three final shots of this beautiful moth. The level of detail even surprised me. I really like the two abstract shots that highlight the beautiful, intricate details of those scales and tiny little hairs that essentially cover the entire specimen. Also, the frontal portrait is quite amazing. I always tend to become quite transfixed when looking at the interesting anatomy of these tiny little creatures. This is it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, then please leave a like, comment below, get in touch with me if you have any questions, and I'll get back to you as always. Thank you so much for watching. If you're new here, please consider subscribing, and see you guys very soon in the next one.